Thanks for joining us for the Fight for Your Marriage podcast with Charlene and Lori. This is a place where you can find hope for your marriage through Jesus Christ. Welcome to another episode of the Fight for Your Marriage podcast. This is Lori, and I'm excited that you are tuning in today to listen to this powerful episode. Did you know that 75% of Christian men and 40% of Christian women report that they are viewing pornography at least occasionally? The numbers for even young adults are worse than that. And that study that was done by Pure Desire Ministries in association with Barna is staggering. And you may have a marriage where you have walked through sexual betrayal, or you've walked through a spouse that has an addiction of pornography. And today's episode is going to be very beneficial to you and eye-opening. I think that if we don't talk about certain topics, we're never going to bring them to the light. And this is an area where we need to have more conversations in our families and in our church about the struggle with sexual addiction. Today, our guest is Nick Stumbo, and he's the executive director of Pure Desire Ministries. And he's going to share what their ministry does to come alongside and help the person who finds themselves in an addiction issue with sexual addictions, and also what they do to come alongside the person that has been betrayed by a spouse in sexual addiction. And I think that you will come out of today's podcast with information, but also with steps that you can take as you go towards healing. This is another episode where you're going to hear that there is hope for every person because of Jesus Christ and the work that he can do in our lives. So I hope that you will tune in to this powerful episode. Nick, thank you for joining us today. I'm excited to introduce our audience to Pure Desire Ministries, and also to just have this very important conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's really a privilege to get to address an area that is impacting so many marriages, and frankly, very few of us hear many conversations about it. So I'm glad we get to do that today. Yeah,
that's very true. Well, tell me a little bit about your story and what drives your passion to help people in the area of sexual betrayal and pornography addiction.
Absolutely. It might not come as a surprise that it's been an area in my life that we had to address, and is why we're so passionate about helping couples now. I grew up in a wonderful Christian home. My dad was a pastor, but like most Christian homes, sexual things were just not talked about. You know, my dad had the birds and the bees conversation with me when I was about 11 years old, and he did probably a great job with that conversation, but that is the only time I can remember us talking about sexuality. And so when I was exposed to some adult content at a friend's house around that time, it felt like this secret that I couldn't tell my mom and dad. I didn't want them to be mad at that friend or not let me go over there. And so it was a secret. And I also felt shame that I was so curious about this thing that I believed to be wrong. Yep. And yet I wanted to see more. And so then as a teenager, as I found some access to pornography, it continued in that place of being both secretive and shameful. And every time that I would stumble into that kind of behavior would feel like, okay, Lord, that was the last time, never again. I'm so sorry. I answered that curiosity, but I don't want that in my life. And yet I would keep doing that month after month after month in a binge purge struggle with pornography. And I think because of the way we often talk about pornography, I didn't even really see it as something that unusual. You know, we talk about, all men struggle, or, lust is normal. And I just felt like I was walking through the teenage, young adult battle with lust and pornography, and that I would eventually grow my way out of it, mature my way out of it, because I really didn't want it in my life. Mm-hmm. And so when I met my future wife during engagement, I told her about this struggle. We had been encouraged by a speaker at our Bible college at a chapel service to tell our spouse everything before we get married and not surprise them after marriage. And that, that made sense to me. That only seemed fair. And so I shared as much as I could about my struggles with pornography. And I remember my wife, my future wife at that time, saying to me, well, why don't you just promise me that you'll never do that again? And I can remember saying to her, as a 21-year-old young man who was sincere in my faith, sincerely in love with her, and truly not wanting this activity in my life, I said, I really want to make you that promise. But I feel like I've made that promise to God and others before. And as hard as I try, it seems to keep coming back in. And so I'm going to do my best, but I don't know if I can make you that promise. And again, I was trying to just have integrity by not making a false promise. But what scares me looking back is that even at that age, I was identifying that there was something in my life that I didn't want, but I didn't know if I had the ability to keep away from it. And when we use that kind of language, really, we're starting to understand the addictive nature of pornography and other sexual struggles. That it's not just that we do it because we want to and then we hide it, that there is something about it that ensnares us in a way that when we're battling it alone, and as I was in that place of a lot of secrecy and shame, we're not successful at overcoming it. And that's what we have found in the ministry that now I get to lead. So all that to say, I took that challenge, that struggle into my marriage and into being a full-time pastor. And for 10 years, that pattern continued, that I could go a month or two with, integrity and not having any struggles, and then would relapse into using pornography. And I would try to be honest with my wife as often as I could to say, hey, I'm still struggling. I'm so sorry. Will you forgive me? But this isn't about you. It's not about our marriage. It's not about anything that's happening in our lives. It's just, this old thing from my teenage years that I haven't been able to kick. And I think in a way I was deceiving myself by minimizing and rationalizing the behavior, convincing myself I'm this close to being free of it. And yet after 10 years, as you might expect, my wife was having a hard time believing those words, believing that it would ever stop or that it would ever change. And what she said to me one night was, Nick, it's not that I hate you, but I hate the way this makes me feel. And because I don't know if it's ever going to change, I don't know if I can stay around for that much pain. And she started to use words like separation, leaving me, taking the kids. And that's a pretty scary place to be because, when you're a pastor, and that's the only thing I've been trained to do, if the pastor's wife leaves him over pornography, usually he doesn't get to be the pastor much longer.
I would imagine.
So in that conversation, everything in my life was on the line.
Yeah.
My marriage, my kids, my ministry, my career. And yet I still didn't know what more to do except try harder not to do this anymore. And it terrified me that I might be one bad decision away from losing everything. But without knowing what else to do, we just created the walls of separation higher, boundaries, not be on the internet, not have cable TV, not go to the store alone, not go to video stores alone. Just if I can keep all the big bad world away from me, maybe I'll be free. And yet I knew that I was only changing things on the outside and nothing on the inside had changed, that I was only a moment away from being in the wrong place at the wrong time and making the wrong decision, and I could shipwreck everything. And so that's the mode that we were in when we first heard about Pure Desire Ministries. Our district of pastors actually was offering a healing pathway for those that wanted help. And because of that, we were introduced to Pure Desire. And for the first time, meeting with people that actually were sincere Christ followers, knew the Word of God, knew what it meant to be a pastor, and understood the brain and addiction science and how all of that could actually be paired together for healing. And so we began going to the 1-year counseling process that Pure Desire offers, and then being in groups, both for myself as the struggler and for my wife as the betrayed spouse who needed support and not accountability. She needed women around her that could help her understand what she was going through. I needed accountability. We would call what she received support. And that year of counseling and groups was transformational in a way that I had never experienced in my behavior, but also in the way it impacted our marriage and the level of depth and intimacy we were able to reach that we had never had before. And so because of that experience, we shared our story with our church and started running groups in our church body. And we saw that what God had done in a healing work in our lives was being replicated for the men and women coming to groups. Because what was happening, it was going to a very deep place in their marriage where we weren't just talking about the finances or the in-laws or the kids, and all those things are important, but at a much deeper level, finding how often sexual dysfunction, or in particular the addictive behaviors of one spouse, we're so often driving the conflict in all those other areas.
Yes.
And so we just became so convinced that this is part of the healing message God has for his people and for the church. And we started telling our story anywhere we could to whoever would listen. And in the end, that became the ongoing connection to Pure Desire and eventually becoming the leader, the executive director in 2016. And so I'm no longer in traditional church ministry, but doing a new kind of ministry to help people find hope, freedom, and healing through Jesus Christ in this very challenging area of sexual brokenness. So that's what we do. That's why it's so personal. We're so passionate about it. And it's such an exciting thing to watch in some of the most messy, hard situations, the way that when real tools and resources are brought into that marriage, you can recover from almost anything if two people are sincerely pursuing that recovery. So, but I would say there are some of those situations that we would all assume, oh, well, you can never come back from that. That when Christ is at work and the couple has faith to say, maybe God can redeem even this, we've seen it happen. And it's really amazing, that transformation. So I get to be in a way on the front lines of that, but it's also my own story that continues to create that passion for me.
Well, that's neat. I love that God, what he has done in your life. And that was my parents' testimony. You know, my dad was exposed to adult material as a child, found a box in the woods with some friends, and that started an addiction for him. And it was the same situation. It was years into a dysfunctional marriage before he revealed what he had been struggling with. And I don't understand, and maybe you can help answer this. Maybe you have the answer. You know, we talk in society about so many addictions, drug addiction, alcohol addiction, and, you know, addiction to our phones and any addiction and mental health issues we want to talk about. But it seems like addictions to sexual material it's like the secret sin. And why do you think that is?
That is such a great question, Lori, and I think really gets at the heart of why churches might struggle to address this. I think there are two primary factors. To me, number one is that sexuality is so deeply personal. It's so intimate. There are parts of it that are private, if we could put it that way, to say it's not appropriate to share that with all people. And we didn't grow up in environments, our homes or churches, that taught us appropriate language to have this conversation in a safe, comfortable way. And so if you bring up, even in many circles, if I say the word pornography, you can just tell, like, there's kind of this fear response of, I don't think we're supposed to talk about this.
Right.
and so it doesn't feel comfortable. And I think that's a barrier that we can overcome. But I think the second area is that we have failed to understand the level at which pornography use or other compulsive sexual behavior really is a brain problem, that there are dysfunctions that have been created in the brain. And I don't mean that in an excusing kind of way, like, well, I can't help it, I've got a brain problem. It's like, no, I made all of the choices that caused me to have this issue.
Right.
But it is what started, you know, the way our founder, Dr. Ted Roberts, says it, is that what started as a moral choice, as a moral issue, became over time a brain issue. And so there are deep similarities with, like, drug addiction, that maybe the first time a person chose to use drugs, yeah, they were making a bad choice. They were with the wrong crowd and some bad friends. And you could look at that and say, man, you could have made better choices. But as they use the drugs, it physically impacts their brain in a way that things like cravings and withdrawal and habituation and tolerance are very real things that we can see happening in the brain. And the same things are happening with pornography use and sexual addiction. So if we could get to the point of acknowledging that's not to excuse the behavior, or that's not to say we can't help it, but it's to underscore the need of recovery and significant support, that someone can't just be told, well, stop doing that, any more than we would just tell a drug addict, stop doing that.
Right.
Yes, we might tell them that, but we would also understand they're going to need support and group and recovery program and all these things, right? Because we've just seen as a culture that addictive behaviors don't just stop because we want them to stop. We need support and we need a program. And that's what Pure Desire is here to do in the realm of our sexuality.
You know, we talk often on our podcast about how there's people sitting in the seats beside us at churches that are struggling secretly with sin and they're struggling and they don't know how to ask for help. They don't know how to admit to other people. On last episode, we said that we should be shouting our sins to each other as much as we shout our Christian, wins, because we need to be upfront and transparent with each other. And it sounds like this is an area where people struggle quietly, thinking, I'm just going to have to keep trying to get over this, but they don't tell people. Do you find that there's a lot of shame and secrecy when people are walking through struggles like this, even in the church?
Very much so. The German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer said that for all of our worship and service and piety, we haven't yet learned how to be together as sinners. And yet the reality is that we are sinners, all of us. And he says when, we're unthinkably horrified when a real sinner is found in our midst. And yet that's all of us.
Right.
So we just did some research with Barna on pornography use among practicing Christians. So a practicing Christian is someone that would say, I attend church regularly and my faith is important to me. Of practicing Christians, 54% acknowledged to using pornography to some degree. So in my knowledge, that is the first time any survey has revealed that a majority of practicing Christians would raise their hand, if they could be honest, and say, I have a level of struggle with pornography. So that breaks down to 75% of men and also 40% of women.
Wow.
Which we don't think of as much. In many Christian circles, we think this is a men's problem and for men only and every man's battle. Well, it turns out increasingly this is happening among our women. And if you look at younger generations of women, like millennial women who are in their mid 30s to late 20s and Gen Z women in their mid 20s to early or late teen years, those numbers are 62% and 64% respectively. So nearly 2/3 of our young Christian women say, me too, I'm struggling. And those numbers would say to churches, this needs to be addressed. Because another question we asked of people who said, I'm struggling with pornography to some degree, they said, who knows about your struggle? Who knows that you view pornography? And there's this long list of a friend, an adult, a coworker, a pastor, basically all the options. And then one of the options was no one. And 48% of practicing Christians said no one.
Wow.
No one knows about this issue in my life. So very secretive. Half of the people would say no one even knows that this is a problem in my life. And then another follow-up question we asked was, is anyone helping you avoid pornography? Again, for those that said this is an issue in my life. And 84% of people in that list said no one. No one is helping me avoid pornography. So if we took that again to any other issue, whether it was a food addiction, gambling, workaholism, all of the vices that we can fall into as humans, if half of us said no one knows about it, and a large majority said, and no one is helping me with it, how successful do we think people in those scenarios would be in overcoming that behavior?
Exactly.
Well, we'd say, well, that's not a winning formula.
Right.
I don't care how much faith you have. If you're doing it alone, isolation is a huge part of the problem. And particularly in this area of our sexuality that, like we've already discussed, is already a little bit personal, feels private, it's kind of messy. And then we say for most of us, no one knows and no one is helping. Well, it shouldn't come as a surprise then that people aren't getting better. They aren't getting the resources they need to really walk in freedom. And to me, then that's the silver lining, because those numbers shouldn't be that hard for us to change.
Right.
Right. If the issue is no one is helping me, well, we can do that. We can help one another. We can support one another. We can pray for one another. We can get honest with one another. And I think about what would happen if that number got flipped upside down. What if 84% of people that have had struggles with pornography said, yes, someone is helping me. My church has a group. My pastor's offering support. My family members have rallied around me and said, we're here for you. If that number flipped upside down, I think we would see a whole new day in this area of sexuality in the church.
And it would trickle down to so many areas of life and to our children, where it could just make such generational changes if we saw that flipped upside down.
Oh, amen. Yes.
Yeah. what can our churches do to talk about this more? Because I would assume across the board, you probably see that it's not a topic that is talked about often in churches.
One starting point is we need to be educated about this. I was in Bible college and seminary for 8 years combined between the two. And I think we had one hour lecture on human sexuality in 8 years.
Wow.
And I have found from pastors I talked to that I've actually got more training than most did because they'll say we had zero. This was never addressed. And there's a reality there that if we don't understand a topic, we're unlikely to speak about it. I was thinking the other day that with my children, I don't think I have ever talked to them about the dangers of trans fats right in our food. I know they exist. I've heard about the dangers of them and why we need to change the ways we eat, but I don't bring it up at home. One, I'm not that concerned about it, and I really don't know what to say. I know they exist, but I don't know what to say. Versus I'm confident there are parents out there that are really concerned about their kids' diet. They've read a lot of articles. They've listened to podcasts. They understand, here are the dangers, and here's why we eat the way we do. And if we took that illustration into sexuality, I think there's a lot to be said there about that commonality. That if we really don't understand it, yes, we know we're sexual. We know everybody's sexual, made by God that way. But what do I really say? Why is it bad? What harms does it have? I'm probably not going to talk about it. So that's one of the reasons that Pure Desire exists, is to help men and women, couples and churches, understand this topic better. We've got an introductory video series. We do a weekly podcast. We do blogs. We have free resources to say, come and understand this problem from a biblical perspective. Because when we're educated, I don't mean you got to become an expert. You don't need to have a college level education. Maybe even a few hours of understanding the brain could equip me to say, man, I'd like to start talking with my kids. I'd like to start having this conversation as part of a sermon series. Because if we're educated on it, equipped a little bit, then we can go to that second level, which is to talk about it.
Right.
We communicate so much by what we don't say, right? When we don't talk about something, if we're the leader, think about this in our homes. If I never bring something up with my kids and then they bring it up and I'm like, oh, we don't talk about that, will they feel safe or comfortable to bring that up anymore? No. And so for most people in churches, the only time I hear about this is either in a long list of sins or in the typical sermon that sex is for marriage and everything outside of that is bad. But we don't have healthy, equipping conversations about human sexuality and God's design and what happens when we buy into a worldly view of sexuality. Then it just feels like, how could I go there for help? Because my church doesn't talk about this. So we need to talk about it. But if we're going to talk about it, we need to be educated and equipped so that we feel like we have something to say on the topic.
Do you think that people that are struggling with it, well, I say struggling with it, people that maybe have an addiction to it, do you think they all realize it's a struggle? Or do some people think, I'm choosing to do this, nobody's getting hurt, I can stop whenever I want, it helps enhance our marriage, there's no harm in this viewing that I'm doing or no harm in being involved in this?
That really varies. Another part of the study, we asked the question of those that acknowledged some level of porn use, are you comfortable with the amount of pornography that you're using? And only 21% of Christians said that they wish they didn't use pornography at all.
Wow.
So a majority, to some degree, are like, yeah, it's not great, but is it really that bad? And so I do think there are needs for the church community, for our pastors and leaders to educate and equip us with why is this harmful. And when I say that, I mean going beyond just saying it's sin.
Right.
Because I think in general, if someone was asked, do you think viewing pornography is sinful? Most would say, yeah, that sounds like lust, and the Bible has all these words against lust. So yeah, it's sinful. But I think maybe we put it in that category of sin that if let's talk about our eating. If I overeat tonight, is that sin? I would say Scripture calls gluttony and eating more than I need, that is sinful behavior.
Right.
But if I had two pieces of pie instead of one, am I that worried about my sin? Probably not. And I think maybe we do that with things like lust and pornography because we do have that mindset of, is it really that bad? And it's only that once in a while. And that's where to develop a greater understanding of how pornography is impacting the brain, how it is impacting our ability to bond appropriately with our spouse and find our spouse beautiful and attractive in the way that God did, because we're creating competition. And then adding on to that, the person being portrayed in pornography, the way that we're objectifying a human being made in the image of God, and how that entire industry is not only objectifying women, but also abusing them. And it is a major driving force in our culture of sex trafficking and sex abuse and violence against women. And the more that we can unpack the evils of pornography, and I'm not just saying like hardcore porn videos, because I think that's another area where a Christian can feel like, well, I don't watch that kind of porn. I'm just into this over here. And we can get a little bit into evaluating our level of poisons. That if I'm not into really bad poison, the poison that I'm choosing is okay. Where really we want to start to have this understanding that says, this is just a very, very unhealthy, ungodly, damaging industry in our world, and I want no part of it. And if I'm engaging even a little bit, I need to elevate my concern to say, this isn't good for me. It's not good for my relationships. It's not good for my children. It's not good for my world. I want to stand against it. Much like so many of us have done with criminalized drugs and activities that we just say, it is not okay. I don't engage in a little bit of cocaine and say, well, because I'm not shooting up every day, the little bit that I consume is okay. Like, no, we would look at it and say that is harmful and bad at any level.
Right.
And I do think there's some work that we could do to see that in our own lives, in our communities. And it is difficult. I would say from my own story, when it is your vice, your challenge, your brain is actively working with you to minimize how you feel about it, to rationalize, because otherwise we would just explode with guilt and shame of why am I doing this? And so like so many other behaviors, there is a process our brain does to go like, is it that big of a deal? And that's why when we keep it secretive and shameful, it's so hard to change, because we begin to listen to our own lies. We can talk ourselves right into continuing to do it. But when we say it out loud to another person, this is what I would always find, that I didn't think things were that bad. But then when I would say it out loud to my wife in my desire to confess and be honest, in so many of those moments, it was like, wow, that sounds so much worse out loud to you than it did in my own head. And that's why I wanted to change, because like, man, why am I putting up with this? But when we keep it secretive and to ourselves, we can rationalize that whole system in a way that not only perpetuates it, but that also increases the likelihood that we might continue to go further than we ever thought we would, which is, as we know in our society, so often the case that by the time someone deals with it, they've gone way, way further down the road than they ever thought they would. And so really, if we can come to this point of just saying, we need to deal with this at the lowest common denominator, because we don't want any of that to happen to anyone, I think we would really start to make strides with it. So that was maybe a long answer to your question. I covered a lot of territory there. If you have any follow-up questions, let me know.
That was great. Do statistics show that there is a need for more that happens with many addictions? When a person starts doing drugs or drinking, they might be fine with one beer and that might be enough. But then as they become an alcoholic, that's not enough. They continue to need more. So do statistics show that that's the way the brain works with sexual addictions as well? Like it gets to the point where it's not enough and they have to keep going deeper into this?
Yes. It's not specific in the survey that we just did. We weren't asking that line of questioning. And I'm not off the top of my head sure what stats or data I could refer to, but I would say that scientifically, the scientific community is showing that to be true. That just like we understand the concept of tolerance for the drug addict, that same process is happening in sexuality. And it explains why someone viewing pornography, if they were to look back at their history, the kind or level of pornography they're interested in now is probably progressed from where they were a year ago or 5 years ago. Because what the brain is really looking for, and this comes into some of God's creation of the brain. God designed our brain to gravitate towards pleasure. I mean, he's the one that made our pleasure center in the brain and dopamine and things that feel good. And he created the nerve endings in our bodies that create excitement and pleasure. We are designed by God to like that and want more of it. So at a brain level, when someone is viewing pornography and reaches a sexual climax, it creates a chemical response in the brain. And part of that chemical response is connected to the novelty of that first experience. And so much like a drug addict, many with pornography are chasing the high that they maybe felt a first time or as a teenager, a sexual encounter that created this flood of brain chemicals. They're still trying to feel that. But every time you look at pornography, this could go into a whole bunch of other brain science if we wanted, you don't quite reach that same level the second time or the third time. And so you either need more of it or you need a progressive level to reach the same level of pleasure. And that's you're pursuing that not because you're bad, evil, or wicked. You're pursuing that because you're human, and your human brain made by God likes pleasure. Now, what is, I think, encouraging is the converse can actually be true in healthy, monogamous sexual relationships. Because when I'm having a sexual encounter with my spouse as God designed, that is safe from other outside intrusions like pornography, there are other chemicals in my brain that are released. Now we're talking about oxytocin and vasopressin that not only bond me to my spouse, but they create this linkage of satisfaction and contentment that tell me this person is mine and the encounter that I've had is meaningful and rich. And so over time, research has actually found that your brain can experience diminishing levels of input, of excitement, and still achieve the same levels of bonding and connection. And I look at that and say, wow, that is God designing our brain for lifelong marriage. Right. Because over time, as our bodies age and our body parts get older, we're not always going to have the exact same physical experience, but the brain response of satisfaction and bonding can be equal. And it's like, wow, that's amazing. So in a godly, healthy marriage, our brain is working for us. In a pornography situation, compulsive behavior, our brain is actually working against us because it's continuing to seek that same feeling of pleasure that simply can't be produced by the same experience. And so we need more and we go further. And in the classic quote, it takes us further than we meant to go, keeps us longer than we meant to stay, and costs us more than we ever thought we'd pay. Yeah, that's the nature of all addictions. And I think we see it particularly in pornography and sexuality.
Yeah. You mentioned your spouse, and there's many spouses who are the victims of a sexual betrayal. And does Pure Desire Ministries have resources for them? I think you said that your spouse went to a class as well, right?
Absolutely. I'm so thankful that when God gave the vision for this ministry to Dr. Ted Roberts, that he also gave it to his wife, Diane Roberts, because they saw, even in the 1990s, as they were pastors at a church, that this was impacting a marriage, and that there really was a flaw at that time, and in some ways to this day, that when someone was caught up in pornography or sexual addiction, the primary methodology had been send the addict away to a retreat center or to a counselor, get them all fixed up and all better, and then send them back and assume that everyone will be okay. Diane Roberts would describe that it'd be like if someone called for an ambulance because they were witnessing an accident, and the ambulance showed up and they picked up the person who made the phone call, leaving the accident victim bleeding out in the street. That's very much a parallel for what's happening in a marriage that's been impacted by habitual pornography use or affairs or other compulsive sexual behavior. The one doing the behavior, yes, needs support to change, but there's a victim. There is someone who has, in a sense, been run over by the sexuality of a partner, that the one who they were most meant to be able to trust, confide in, feel safe with, turns out to be someone that was lying, hiding, or unsafe. And what we're able to recognize is that really creates, for many people, now not all, but for a vast majority, it creates a trauma response in their brain and their body. So trauma, we don't want to overemphasize this, but trauma at its base level is just an experience that communicates to me I'm not safe, that this is not a secure environment, and I need to do things that I can keep myself safe. And that is another function of how God designed our brain to work. And for so many spouses, when the person they've been married to reveals that there's all these hidden things that they didn't know about that really strike at some of the very core of their sense of identity and worth and value, because that's in its nature how God designed our sexuality to work, the brain and body feel unsafe and begin to seek out safety, which might look like in a relationship, that might look like anger, that can look like compulsive needs to check a spouse's phone or to find out where they are.
Mm-hmm.
It might look like mothering or policing a spouse. And it's not because they're bad, evil, or wicked. It's their brain feeling unsafe and trying to find out, can I be safe in this relationship? And that's why it's so important that a spouse gets support from others, because typically the one who created the trauma, the sense of unsafety, is not the same person, at least in that moment,
mm-hmm.
who can help heal the trauma.
Right.
Now, as a spouse, like in our story, as I got better, as I began to really acknowledge my patterns and make changes and make commitments and honor them, I could provide help for my wife, but she needed other women that could say, we've been there.
Mm-hmm. We
know what you're going through. You're not going crazy. The ways you feel, like, is anything real? Yeah, that's what happens. And here's what we can do to grow for ourselves, how we can start to find safety perhaps in other relationships. What kind of structures does a spouse need to learn to trust their other spouse again? And that's why a group like Pure Desire, I think, is so important in a recovery for that marriage. Because what happens too often is couples will go to a well-intended counselor or pastor who's just trying to help them, but isn't really educated in some of the trauma being caused and what boundaries and structure is needed to create health. And they'll say things like, well, how much sex are you having?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in the wrong context, more sex may be absolutely the wrong thing.
Right.
It's just creating more trauma for one partner and perpetuating some sexual dysfunction for the other, who, because they're getting that sexual high, maybe they're not dealing with some of what they need to deal with. So when you're in this kind of situation, what I would want to say to that spouse is, what you're feeling is very legitimate, and you're not going crazy, and you're not the only one. And your spouse's behaviors are not because of you. That's one of the things we've been able to help people recognize through our workbooks and the classes that we have, is that a person's sexual addiction or a pornography addiction is actually not about sex. Mm-hmm. It's not because men are so sexual. It's because it has been linked to how they deal with life, how they've learned to cope, how they've learned to handle stress. Just the way they do life has become wrapped up in their sexual expression.
Right.
And the spouse is not the one who caused it. And conversely, the spouse is not the one who can fix it. Mm-hmm. And we still have too many counselors or pastors trying to say, well, just have more sex and he'll be better. And that's not the answer.
Right.
It's like saying to the drug addict, if we can just give you a healthier drug, you'll be better off. No, we need to look at why you need the drug at all.
Right.
Because so many Christian men, and to a degree Christian women, that are struggling with pornography are actually using the marriage bed as a part of their unhealth. Mm-hmm. And we need to be able to step back and in a way of analyzing, what does it look like to bring healthy sexuality back to the marriage, not just assume that more sex will fix it. So a lot of pointers there to say, if you're the spouse on the other side of this, you need support. Mm-hmm. You need people that understand what you're going through. And you need to have a framework to understand, how do I rebuild trust in my marriage? And to be able to communicate that to your spouse in a way that says, for us to grow, here are some things we're going to need to address. And then that can become, as we've seen, that can become a very life-giving transformational process for a couple.
Do you think it's beneficial for the betrayed spouse to start going and getting some help on their own if their spouse is unwilling to admit anything at that point? Is it helpful for them to start getting treatment and to get some counseling?
Very much so.
Okay.
And that's reality. We found this in some of the research that couples were asked, have you had a spouse using pornography in the marriage? And at least 36% of couples said, yeah, that's been an issue in our marriage. And when they asked men, was this positive or negative? Men were much more neutral, or said, overall it was positive if their spouse was using pornography. Mm. And I think that may be because if men had a wife using pornography, it was often as a way to create more sex in the marriage. Mm-hmm. And they're like, man, it seemed like it worked out okay. It was a short-term win for a long-term loss.
Right.
But when women were asked, was this positive or negative in the relationship? Overwhelmingly, a majority of women said it was a negative experience. Mm. And what that underscores for me is within the marriage, men and women may be having very different experiences. And so maybe you're trying to say to your husband, we need help, you need to change, I don't like this. And because of what they're stuck in and the patterns that they've convinced themselves of, they're not feeling like, is it that big of a deal? I think you're overreacting. And so it underscores you may need to get help before they're ready. You may need to go and understand what's happening and understand your voice and have a place where you can be heard and have your feelings validated in a way that, and here's what I would say, it's not just to create a husband bashing club, right? It's not just, well, he's so terrible, so you go work on you. It's he may not be ready or able to understand what's going on, and you may not have yet understood the tools or resources to voice what's going on for you and to voice what you need in order for the marriage to repair. So we have seen that very often, that a wife, or in some cases, we do have groups for betrayed men, and it might be the man coming in, who have just said, I'm sick of this. I'm so tired of what's happening in marriage, and I just don't know what else to do.
Yeah.
And as they get in group, as they get others that support them, they begin to find their voice, and they are able in a constructive way to go back and say, here's what I'm willing to put up with, and here's what I'm not willing to put up with. And if these things continue to happen, here are steps I'm going to need to take for my safety, for my recovery. And if you're unwilling to do those things, we may need to address if this marriage is working, because that does become a question then of a person's heart, right? It's not just, can I divorce my spouse over pornography? The question is, what if my spouse is unwilling to address a behavior that I have communicated is causing harm and pain to me? That person is beginning to act now more like an unbeliever or someone that does not have a heart of love for their spouse. So it does create some of the necessary friction, and that's what I was going to share. We have often seen that a wife comes to group, and if she starts to find some support and some help and in a reasonable way communicate her needs, that creates sometimes the tension and friction that the husband goes, oh man, I better go get help. Because I believe the average Christian husband doesn't want to hurt his wife. He doesn't want to damage his marriage. And when he hears about it in a way that begins to connect the dots, he will say, oh, shoot, I better go get help or I'm going to lose this marriage. And I've told many men in groups, because I've probably led 200 men in groups over the last 15 years, if not more. And I've said to them, if you are here to make your wife happy and fix your marriage, you're in the right place. That motive is good enough. Because if it will get you started, let's use it. Yeah. And what I have found is as they get going and they get a month or two down the road, some things will start to click. Their eyes, I've literally had men describe it as like a fog begins to lift and they say, oh, wow, I can't believe I was doing this to my wife. I can't believe I was letting myself do this. How could I put up with that? And they start to be motivated to change for themselves. But maybe initially they're so stuck in the fog of it, they can't see it. So if wives can create a little bit of that healthy, appropriate tension to say, you need to fix this or else, often that becomes what gets them moving. So if you're ready to get help, go for it. Because a healthier you will always be the best probability for a healthier marriage.
That's amazing. Let me go back to what you said as we wrap up here about isolation. And for a person that's listening to this, and maybe it's not a topic that's being talked about in their church and they don't have access right now to hearing, about this corporately and hearing how there's help, what can we do in our small groups and in our friend circles to, bring this topic to the forefront more and kind of normalize discussing it so there can be help and accountability?
There are a number of ways that we could communicate environments of grace and love. In a small group, a comment may come up about, man, I caught my kid with pornography on his phone, and someone in the group may react like, oh, that stuff is so awful. I can't believe anyone would do that. Well, if anyone in this circle is struggling, it's like, okay, never going to bring that up here.
Right.
What would it look like for others of us to step in and say, this is actually very common, even among Christians. I just heard a podcast that said 54% of practicing Christians have this struggle. And if someone was struggling, what would it look like for us to be safe enough for them to confide in us? Maybe not the whole group, but one-on-one, to pray for each other, to encourage one another. I mean, there's all these one another's in the Bible that how can we one another if I don't even feel safe to bring up what I need help with? You can't support me, pray for me, carry my burdens if I can't tell you about it.
Right.
So I think in our small group environments, it's just being able to say whenever we can, like, We're here for you. If this is an area, we want to help you. I think encouraging people to get help and not see that as a bad thing. Going and seeing a counselor can be a wonderful starting place. Now, I would say we have a paradigm in the church that we do kind of say, well, just go talk to a counselor and go deal with it there. But if we don't at some point learn to share with people close to us, with our peers in a group environment, if we only go to a counselor, I have found that actually doesn't do much to decrease shame and secrecy and isolation. Because if you think about it, when I go to a counselor, I'm going to a paid professional,
right,
whose job it is to hear all of my stuff, provide me help, and they are sworn to confidence no matter what I say.
Right.
And that, like I said, that can be helpful to start, getting some stuff out and processing. But if I never go beyond that, and I come back to the rest of my life, it's like, well, if anybody else who's not a paid professional heard this, they would reject me. Then we're going to be stuck in shame. And so there is a beautiful role of the church, of small groups, groups of men. I think it happens best, small groups of men, small groups of women that can meet and say, hey, if this is an issue for any of us, let's be real. Yeah. Let's tell one another and let's offer prayer and grace and support, because when we can do it with others and they know our stuff and they still love us, they still accept us, that then can create momentum and change. And it's why from the very beginning, the primary model for Pure Desire, like what we do as a ministry, is invite people into groups. And we have group resources and group materials. And we have over 1,200 churches around the world that are running a Pure Desire group. We have online groups that we run because we just are so convinced that if someone can get into a group environment and walk through a process of change with other men and other women, that's the healing environment.
Right.
So if you're listening and you don't know where to start because it's an issue in your life, but no one around you seems to be talking about it, we can help you find a group where people are talking about it. And as you get some freedom there, you might be the person that could start to bring some change into your small group or your church community as you get equipped and get healthy in this area.
That's great. We need to see these statistics flipped upside down, and it's possible. It is possible.
Amen.
Well, Nick, how can people connect with Pure Desire Ministries?
Yeah, just visit us on our website, puredesire.org. That's you're going to find free resources and tools, as well as the group workbooks and materials that do have a cost with them. Like I mentioned, we have a weekly podcast. And so wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find the Pure Desire podcast. And for women, because we've recognized that a lot of women are asking particular questions, we have a second podcast for women called Unfiltered. So if you search Unfiltered by Pure Desire, you can find that podcast. We're also on YouTube. If you prefer video, you can find Pure Desire has a channel with new content every week. And we have just found that if people can enter that safe community, because online feels safe, right? I can watch a YouTube video and I don't have to tell people I'm watching a video about pornography. I can watch and learn and grow, and that might be what helps me take the next step towards healing. So find us on your podcast channel on YouTube or visit our website, puredesire.org.
Wonderful. Well, as we finish up, would you mind praying for those that are going to be listening to this episode and those that are struggling and walking through this in their marriages?
I would be happy to. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you that you are the God of our sexuality. You designed it, you created it for good purposes and on purpose. And yet, Lord, so many of us have had very difficult, negative, even sinful encounters with sexuality, whether for ourselves or by things that have been done to us. God, it can be a very hurtful, difficult challenge in our lives. And so, God, I pray that we would know your grace even in this area of our lives. We would know that you don't run from this area. God, you're present. You know, you see, you understand, and even here you love us well. And so I pray that if we are someone who has an unaddressed struggle, that even today, you would give us the courage to take one small step towards healing, that we would listen to a podcast, we would look for a group, we would seek out a friend where we could get honest, and that you would begin a healing work that in your grace and in your power, you would carry through to completion. And if we're a spouse, Lord, that is feeling hurt, betrayed, trapped, unsure where to turn, that today they would know they're not alone. You have a plan for them, and that as they pursue healing for themselves, you can work in their spouse. God, I pray that for many today, as they hear this, they would be released from a burden of trying to fix their spouse or thinking they can keep their spouse from struggling. Lord, that is that is not a burden you've asked any of us to carry, to keep someone else from sinning. Lord, help us to do the work we can to be healthy so that we might appropriately encourage and love and pray for our spouses. But God, I pray that we would not be the one that feels like we're trying to fix them. So God, for the betrayed spouse, I just pray they would also be able to take a step towards support and recovery. And Lord, for all those listening that they don't know, they're not sure, this has not come up in their marriage, God, I pray that you would just give them wisdom, discernment, how to have healthy conversations in their marriage, to check in with the spouse and say, how are we doing? And if they find out there's more going on than they anticipated, God, would you lead them towards places of healing and towards recovery? Because God, we know that as we experience healing, so many more can be healed as well. Not only other couples around us, but our kids and grandkids and those generations that will come after us. I pray that we would be a part of a generation that begins to change the tide of sexual devastation and instead can walk in the sexual wholeness that you designed us for. So, Lord, lead us in that. And thank you for this opportunity to come to you in this challenging area of our life and know that you will guide and lead us in your love. And so we thank you and we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Nick. I hope that this episode was beneficial to you, and I hope you walked away with information that will help you as you journey towards a healed marriage. I wanted to let you know that you can find information on Pure Desire Ministries in our show notes and some of the resources that they offer for free. You can also go to their website and find out if there is a church in your area or an online group that would work for you to get involved and to start finding healing if you and your spouse are struggling in this area of sexual addiction. Thanks for joining us today as we proclaim that God heals hurting marriages. Take time to visit our website at rejoiceministries.org for additional resources for your marriage.